There was a time when Christian Salvesen didn't need branding, slogans, or shiny trucks to be taken seriously. If you worked logistics, distribution, cold storage, or long-haul transport in Britain, the name already carried weight. Not in a loud way, not in a motorway-dominating way like Eddie Stobart, but in a quieter, more institutional sense. Christian Salvesen was everywhere without ever trying to be noticed. For drivers, planners, warehouse staff, and depot managers, Salvesen was the kind of company that just existed in the background of working life. You might not have driven directly for them, but you worked alongside them, shared depots, shared customers, shared roads. They were embedded into the system in a way few people outside the industry ever noticed. Christian Salvesen wasn't built on flash or personality. It was built on infrastructure. The company's roots went back generations, long before modern haulage even looked the way it does now. It grew into a logistics powerhouse quietly, steadily, almost cautiously. By the time most people recognized the name, it was already deeply entrenched in food distribution, cold storage, warehousing, and supply chains that Britain relied on every single day. Supermarkets, food producers, retail networks. If it needed temperature control and reliability, Salvesen was probably involved somewhere. To drivers, Salvesen felt different from typical haulage firms. It wasn't about racing the clock on motorway trunking or chasing visibility. It was about systems, schedules, precision. You turned up, you did the job, and the operation ran like it had done the same thing 1,000 times before, because it had. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Cold chain work meant long waits, strict procedures, and zero tolerance for mistakes. You didn't rush Salvesen jobs. You followed process, you waited on bays, you checked temperatures, you signed paperwork carefully. The pressure wasn't speed, it was accuracy, and that suited a certain kind of driver, people who valued predictability over adrenaline. In depots, Salvesen felt almost institutional. Corporate, yes, but not detached. There were layers of management, but the system made sense. The company knew its niche and stayed inside it. It wasn't trying to dominate motorways with branding or turn drivers into walking advertisements. It was quietly moving food, stock, and essential goods in the background while flashier names soaked up attention. For a long time, that strategy worked perfectly. Christian Salvesen expanded across the UK and Europe, building warehouses, cold stores, distribution hubs. The scale was enormous, but the growth was measured. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't rushed. The company understood that logistics wasn't about headlines. It was about not failing. When you're responsible for perishable goods, failure isn't loud. It's expensive, silent, and unforgiving. Drivers and staff trusted Salvesen because it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It wasn't selling a dream. It was selling reliability. And in logistics, reliability is everything. But as the years went on, the industry around Salvesen began to change. Logistics stopped being treated as an operational necessity and started being treated as a financial instrument. Supply chains became assets. Warehouses became leverage. Distribution networks became things that could be bought, sold, merged, and restructured by people who never stood on a frozen loading bay at 3 in the morning waiting for a temperature check to clear. Christian Salvesen, by its nature, was perfectly positioned for that shift. It had assets, lots of them, land, warehouses, cold storage facilities, long-term contracts, predictable revenue. To investors and larger logistics groups, that made it extremely attractive. On the ground, not much seemed to change at first. Trucks still rolled in and out, bays still filled, drivers still waited, paperwork still piled up. The system kept running. That was the strength of Salvesen. It absorbed change without making noise. But behind the scenes, decisions were starting to move further away from the depots. Ownership structures shifted. Strategic reviews happened, consultants came in, the language began to change, less about operations, more about optimization, portfolio alignment, synergies, words that sounded impressive in boardrooms but meant very little to the people actually keeping food moving across the country. Salvesen wasn't failing. Far from it. That was the irony. It was successful enough to become something else entirely. As consolidation swept through logistics, Christian Salvesen became part of a wider game, one where scale mattered more than identity, where having your own name mattered less than fitting neatly into a larger corporate structure. The company that had once operated quietly but independently now found itself increasingly shaped by forces that didn't care about history. Drivers began to notice subtle shifts, new policies, new reporting lines, new expectations that didn't quite match the reality of the work. The job was still there, but it felt more abstract, less rooted. The sense that Salvesen was a standalone entity began to blur. Warehouses that had once felt permanent suddenly felt temporary. Not because they were closing, but because they no longer felt owned in the same way. Everything felt like it could be reallocated, rebranded, or absorbed at any moment. And that's the part most people missed. Christian Salvesen didn't disappear because it collapsed. It didn't vanish in scandal. It didn't implode under debt or mismanagement. It simply became less visible as it was folded into a much larger logistics machine that had no need for the name to survive. At the time, no one called it an ending. It just felt like the company was slowly stepping back. Even while the work continued uninterrupted, for the people inside it, that quiet shift was unsettling. You don't notice disappearance when it happens gradually. You notice it later, when you realize a name that once defined entire parts of the industry is no longer being said out loud. And that is where the story really begins. The strange thing about Christian Salvesen's disappearance is that nothing ever stopped working. Lorries still arrived on time, cold stores still hummed through the night, supermarket shelves stayed full. From the outside, logistics carried on as if the name had never mattered at all. And that's exactly why so few people noticed what was happening in real time. Inside the depots, the changes felt subtle but persistent. New logos appeared on paperwork, new email signatures, new reporting structures that didn't quite line up with how things had always been done. The Salvesen name was still there, but it was no longer central. Drivers who lived through that period often struggled to explain what was lost, because nothing obvious broke, nothing dramatic happened, but something important was stripped away quietly. A sense that logistics was still being run by companies with their own identity, their own philosophy, their own understanding of the work beyond profit. Today, the work Salvesen once did is still being done, often in the same buildings, sometimes by the same people, but the name is gone, and with it, a reminder that not every disappearance in this industry comes from failure. Some come from success that makes you valuable enough to erase. And that's what makes the story uncomfortable. Christian Salvesen didn't collapse under pressure. It didn't mismanage itself into oblivion. It was quietly dismantled by a system that no longer needed its identity, only its infrastructure. By the time anyone realized the name had truly vanished, there was nothing left to save.